We'll go ahead and get started. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar tonight, our first of our 250th series, Remembering the Revolution webinars. My name is Derek Heidemann, and I'm the Director of Research, Curatorial, and Preservation here at Old Sturbridge Village. And tonight's presenter is John Rees, who will be presenting on African-American soldiers in the American Revolution. Before we get to John's talk and talking a little bit about his background, I do just want to share some logistics and also just start with a land acknowledgement. So, I'd like to acknowledge that Old Sturbridge Village is located on the traditional land of the Nipmuc peoples. New England and the rest of the United States consist of land expropriated from Native American peoples. We honor the land and the indigenous peoples who have stewarded it through the generations and continue to steward it today. So this program is being recorded and will be posted on the Old Sturbridge Village YouTube page after the event. I encourage you to visit it all. We do have other webinars, and we will have future webinars from the other webinars of this series on there as well. There'll also be a question and answer session following our discussion tonight. So I invite the live viewers tonight to submit questions in the Q&A function, and then we'll get to those at the end. So with that, let me talk a little bit about my good friend, John Rees. So John Rees has been writing for almost 40 years on the experiences of common soldiers and the women of the armies of the American Revolution. To date, he's authored over 200 articles, most available free online. His first book, They Were Good Soldiers, African Americans Serving in the Continental Army, 1775 to 1783, was published in 2019. And his second book, titled Don Troiani's Black Soldiers in America's Wars, 1754 to 1865, became available in January of 2025 and is actually available in the Old Sturbridge Village gift shop. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, John, to start your presentation.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Derek. I really appreciate it. It's really nice to be here. In a relatively short time, we'll take a look at Continental Army Black soldiers, and along the way, I'll share the stories of several individuals, discuss how soldiers of color were treated, and tie it all together with insights into their numbers. I'll also briefly discuss some of the women of color who followed the Army. One of the first pieces I uncovered relating to Continental Army Black soldiers was in Massachusetts white veteran Henry Hallowell's memoir, in which he gave this simple but fitting tribute. In my company, there was 4 Negroes named Jephthah Ward, Job Upton, Douglas Middleton, and Pomp Simmons. Part of them called on me after their time was out. They were good soldiers. Those veterans' military records showed widely ranging wartime experiences. Jephthah Ward served 5 years from 1779 to 1783. Job Upton enlisted in May 1777 and served only 1 year, while Douglas Middleton served 3 years beginning in April 1777. Pomp Simmons served 6 years, enlisting March 1778 for 3 years and re-enlisting in 1781 for the war. That year, Simmons went to Virginia under the Marquis de Lafayette and served in that hard-marching summer campaign against Lieutenant General Charles Lord Cornwallis's army. Those operations precipitated the British surrender at Yorktown. Hal's encomium and those soldier service records, plus my early reading of Benjamin Quarles's excellent 1961 book, The Negro and the American Revolution, were among the resources that pushed me to learn more about the men of color who fought in our founding war. But first, I want to place this presentation within a larger context. At the beginning of the Revolutionary War, Britain's North American colonies contained about 2.5 million inhabitants. Among those are 456,000 enslaved men, women, and children, plus 24,000 free blacks. At the same time, Britain had about 8 million residents, including 15 to 20,000 of African descent. By contrast, in 1780, the British Caribbean islands contained 489,000 enslaved people and only 48,000 whites. North American and British Caribbean enslaved populations grew until British mid-1830s gradual manumission and United States abolition in 1865. Enslaved men served under arms in relatively large numbers in the Continental Army and in return were often freed by their owners or by state law at the end of their enlistments or post-war. Enslaved black soldiers were rare in British loyalist, French, Spanish, and German forces serving in the Revolution. And black soldiers in British, Loyalist, French, and Spanish forces were usually formed into segregated regiments, or segregated units. With that, we'll segue into our main subject with this discussion of the segregated regiments of color and 4 combatant contingents that served in the War of the Revolution. Segregated regiments and companies were formed by several nations during the war. These examples serve as a counterpoint to the standard practice in the Continental Army and State Militias, 1775 to 1783. The earliest unit that we're speaking of was the Loyalist Ethiopian Regiment, formed in 1775 by Crown Governor John Murray, Earl of Dunmore, with freed slaves, mostly from Virginia. Also known as Dunmore's Black Regiment, that unit was involved in a November 1775 action near Norfolk, Virginia, and then 24 days later in the Great Bridge Battle, where British and Loyalist forces were defeated. Decimated by smallpox and other diseases, in June 1776, Dunmore wrote, "Had it not been for this horrid disorder, I should have had 2,000 blacks." When that unit was disbanded in September 1776, roughly 300 black men, women, and children remained. Of those, only 150 were soldiers. 6 months later, in March 1777, British Commander-in-Chief Sir William Howe directed that all Negroes, meaning enslaved blacks, mulattoes or free blacks, and other improper persons who have been admitted into Loyalist Corps be immediately discharged. In essence, this meant that armed blacks were barred from serving in Crown-established Loyalist regiments. In March 1779, France formed the Chasseurs Volontaires de Saint-Domingue in what later became known as Haiti. The regiment consisted of free men of color with blacks and mulattoes separated into their own companies, reflecting the colorism rife in Saint-Domingue society. The Chasseurs Volontaires' white commander, Colonel Rouvray, was proud of his men, who joined without enlistment bonuses. And in light of the shameful treatment given free blacks on Saint-Domingue by white Creoles, the colonel asked for the abolishment of, quote, humiliating and degrading distinctions that had been heaped upon them. He also wished his men's creed would be, "I must make the whites blush for the scorn they have heaped on me and my civil status, and for the injustices and tyrannies they have continually exercised over me with impunity. I must prove to them that as a soldier I am capable of at least as much honor and courage, and of even more loyalty." The regiment's only large-scale action was at the siege of British-held Savannah in autumn 1779. Most of the unit was disbanded by early 1780, but one element served until 1784 on the West Indian island of Grenada. And the Spanish free black and mulatto battalions of Havana, segregated by color, were first formed in Cuba in 1762. Men of color joining these units enjoyed a rise in societal status, plus special benefits for themselves and their families. Picked detachments fought well during the 1781 operation to take Pensacola, Florida, from the British. They remained in high esteem well into the 19th century. In 1795, one of the most severe white detractors felt compelled to state they were, quote, without a doubt some of the best soldiers in the world. Contrary to those examples, the Continental Army was largely integrated from the first day of the conflict to its last, while British regiments had only black musicians, servants, and laborers, and most Loyalist units followed suit. That said, there was a single segregated Continental Army regiment manned by private soldiers of black or Indian heritage, commanded by white officers, sergeants, and corporals. That unit was the so-called Black 1st Rhode Island Regiment. In time, it became the corps most often associated with African American Revolutionary soldiers. Although the unit was an outlier in a largely integrated army, it saw hard service and has an intriguing, though much mythologized history, and as such, it should be discussed in some detail. Little is known of African American numbers in the early war Rhode Island military establishment, but in 1775, Massachusetts General William Heath noted, "The regiments of Rhode Island have a number of Negroes and Indians." All the Rhode Island regiments from 1775 through 1777 contained soldiers of color serving alongside their white comrades. With the Continental Army's 1777 rebirth, only the 1st and 2nd Rhode Island regiments remained, recruited with men enlisted or re-enlisted for 3 years or the duration of the war. On October 22, 1777, the 2 Rhode Island regiments, supported by artillery, successfully defended Fort Mercer in New Jersey against a brigade of Hessian troops. And I have to note here that this action occurred 4 months before the Rhode Island Segregated Black Regiment was formed. 5 days after the battle, both regiments numbered 369 non-commissioned officers, musicians, and privates. Of those fighting at Fort Mercer, 48, 12.6%, were soldiers of color, including 39 African Americans, 10.6% of the whole. The Rhode Island regiments were particularly hard hit during the 1777 campaign, and the state had to consider how to recruit them. General James Varnum recommended in January 1778 that a battalion of Negroes be raised in Rhode Island. That February, the state legislature resolved that any Negro, mulatto, or Indian man slave in this state may enlist into either of the two battalions to serve during the continuance of the war. It was eventually determined that these recruits would join only the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, and that unit would be filled with freed slaves, free blacks and Indians, as well as veteran black and Indian soldiers. Governor Nicholas Cook noted in late February, the number of slaves in this state is not great, but it is generally thought that 300 and upwards will be enlisted. And any slaves accepted received their freedom and their owners reimbursed. Unpopular with many residents, in early May, the Rhode Island legislature set a June 1778 cutoff for slave recruiting, though free blacks and Indians could continue to enlist. And despite Governor Cook's assurances, less than 190 black men ever served with the 1st Regiment. While the 1st Rhode Island command staff was recruiting slaves in their home state, the regiment's white enlisted personnel remaining at Valley Forge were incorporated into the 2nd Regiment. At the same time, the veteran black and Indian soldiers from both regiments were formed into a single segregated company under Captain Thomas Arnold. Arnold's company belonged to the absent 1st Regiment, but while with the main army, fielded with Colonel Israel Angel's 2nd Rhode Island. When Washington's forces confronted the British at the June 28, 1778 Battle of Monmouth, Captain Arnold's segregated company marched with Varno's brigade in Major General Charles Lee's advance force. About midday on the 28th, having earlier attacked the British rearguard, Lee's advance force retreated in the face of superior forces, withdrawing towards General Washington's marching troops. Meeting the main army, General Lee encountered Washington, who placed him in charge of a temporary holding action. Lieutenant Colonel Jeremiah Olney described the Rhode Island troops during the ensuing defense. After retiring something more than a mile, Varno's brigade, including the Rhode Islanders, were ordered to halt and form by a cross fence to cover 2 pieces of artillery, which were in danger of being lost. We there exchanged about 10 rounds and were then obliged to retire with considerable loss, but not until the enemy had outflanked us and advanced with charged bayonets to the fence by which we had formed. Our brigade suffered more than any that was engaged. Captain Arnold's leg was amputated as a result of a wound in that action, and one of his men, Richard Rhodes, related in the 19th century, he is very much crippled in one arm in consequence of a wound received in the Battle of Monmouth. He was born in Africa, brought to this country and sold as a slave, and enlisted in the Black Regiment to obtain his freedom. Arnold's company was united with the 1st Rhode Island Regiment in July 1778. That regiment saw combat at the August 29, 1778 Battle of Rhode Island and remained in their home state until marching to New York in early 1781. Thus, the segregated 1st Rhode Island Regiment existed as such from March 1778 to June 1780, 2 years and 3 months. And during that same period, the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment was segregated white. The segregated 1st Rhode Island Regiment was never large enough to form a full regiment, and because of that never served with Washington's main army until 1781, when its remaining 2 companies were consolidated with the 2nd Regiment to form a single Rhode Island Regiment. So let's briefly recount Rhode Island soldier of color numbers from 1777 to 1781. We've already seen that at the October 1777 Fort Mercer battle, black soldiers comprised 10.6% of the 2 Rhode Island Regiment's strength. In August 1778, the segregated 1st Rhode Island Regiment was at its greatest strength with 188 black soldiers plus 5 Indians and 4 mixed Indian Africans, also called mustees. By June 1780, only 124 black and Indian soldiers remained. Those men were formed into 2 large companies and attached to an understrength 6-month state levy battalion with Colonel Green commanding. Early in 1781, those 2 remaining companies were joined with the men of the 2nd Regiment to form the Rhode Island Regiment. That September, just prior to the Yorktown siege, that corps had 7 white companies and 2 mixed black and Indian companies. Combined, those last 2 companies numbered 108 privates. Adding black musicians and men on other duty, at that time black soldiers comprised 31% of the Rhode Island Regiment. Summing up, the segregated 1st Rhode Island Regiment was an outlier, an experiment born of necessity in an army of integrated units. That experiment was largely unsuccessful through no fault of their own. The fact that the regiment remained seriously understrength for the entire term of its existence was largely due to the Rhode Island legislature cutting off slave enlistment after only 4 months after it had begun. Still, in the 19th century, the so-called Black Regiment became a symbol and example of African American ability as soldiers, and was seen by many as the precursor of the United States Colored Regiments and later segregated American units that served from the 1860 Civil War into the mid-20th century. Now let's look at the rest of the Continental Army. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When those words were made public in 1776, Africans had been enslaved in British North America for almost 160 years, and African Americans, free and enslaved, had been fighting 14 months for the cause of American independence in the Continental Army, Navy, and States Militia. Not for another 89 years would slavery in the United States be legally ended. Black soldiers' motivation for joining the Continental Army and their treatment while serving are important to any discussion of their military experience. The reasons free blacks enlisted somewhat mirrored those of their fellow white and Indian soldiers. Some fought for national independence and hoped for opportunities in a new republic. Some joined for the adventure of military service, sometimes connected to the prospect of serving alongside family or friends. Others were at least partly enticed by the lure of an enlistment bounty or regular pay. Some joined as paid substitutes in place of those who could afford the fee. And after the ideals espoused in the Declaration of Independence, some men fought for their own freedom or for that of their loved ones. Forced service was another factor. If they were on the militia rolls, both white and black men periodically faced the chance of being drafted for a short-term stint in the Continental Regiment. Whites were occasionally compelled to enlist, but enslaved African Americans were more often coerced or forced by their masters to serve. Many, especially in New England, were promised freedom in return for military service. Most of those promises were honored, but some veterans were kept in bondage after discharge. Of course, the major dividing line between white and black common soldiers was the American system that enslaved 95% of the country's people of African descent and relegated blacks to underclass status. In light of their treatment in civilian society, one remarkable result of researching black Continental soldiers is finding that they largely received the same considerations as their white comrades. At the most basic level, soldiers of color, both African and Native Americans, received the same pay, provisions, clothing, and equipment as white soldiers. Both whites and soldiers of color equally enjoyed the rare times of bounty and suffered together in times of scarcity. The most glaring case of unequal treatment was that black soldiers were, with very few exceptions, barred from serving in any rank other than drummer, fifer, or private soldier. There are also indications that black enlisted men served as officer servants more often than white soldiers, but that remains unsubstantiated. Finally, while there were likely difficulties due to officers or fellow soldiers' personal or race animus, to date, no such instances have come to light. Now let's turn to an overview of early service. Black Americans were in the fight from the first. Massachusetts militiamen of color, free and enslaved, fought alongside their white comrades from Lexington to Concord and back to Boston on April 19, 1775. To date, we have the names of 35 black men present that day, at least 18 seeing combat. One man, Prince Estabrook, was wounded with Captain John Parker's company on Lexington Green. It's likely that as many as 40 to 50 African Americans were with the militia on the war's first day. And I must note that the black musket-bearing soldiers, Continentals and militia, went on to fight in every major battle of the war and in most, if not all, of the lesser actions. 2 months later, at least 88 black and 15 Indian soldiers are known to have served at the June 17 Bunker Hill battle. One historian estimates the total may have been as high as 150, roughly 5% of American troops involved. There are several mentions of black participation in those early actions, but this is my favorite, speaking to the courage and resilience of African American soldiers and the effect one man's determination had on another. John Greenwood, a white soldier, noted, "Everywhere the greatest terror and confusion seemed to prevail as I ran along the road leading to Bunker Hill. It was filled with chairs and wagons, bearing the wounded and dead. Never having beheld such a sight before, I felt very much frightened. I could positively feel my hair stand on end. Just as I came near the place, a Negro man, wounded in the back of his neck, passed me, and his collar being open, and he not having anything on except his shirt and trousers, I saw the wound quite plainly and the blood running down his back. I asked him if it hurt much, and he said no, that he was only going to get a plaster put on it and meant to return. You cannot conceive what encouragement this immediately gave me. I began to feel brave and like a soldier from that moment, and fear never troubled me afterward during the whole war." Despite their proven ability, early on, some considered African Americans unfit for military service. While enslaved men were barred in summer 1775, That autumn, attempts were made to reject free blacks as well. In September, New Jersey Congressman Richard Smith noted, in Congress, Tuesday 26th, the committee brought in a letter to General Washington. In the course of it, South Carolinian Edward Rutledge moved that the general shall discharge all Negroes as well slaves as freemen in his army. He, Rutledge, was strongly supported by many of the Southern delegates, but so powerfully opposed that he lost the point. In October 1775, Council of Officers agreed unanimously to reject all slaves and by a great majority to reject Negroes altogether, while November 12 Army orders directed neither Negroes, boys unable to bear arms, nor old men unfit to endure the fatigues of the campaign are to be enlisted. Now, while the term Negro usually referred to enslaved people, these orders seem to have been taken as a rejection of all black soldiers. But still, they continued to serve. Signaling a change of policy, at the end of December, General Washington told of numbers of free Negroes desirous of enlisting and gave leave to the recruiting officers to entertain them. But on January 16, 1776, Congress resolved that the free Negroes who have served faithfully in the Army at Cambridge may be reenlisted therein, but no others. Despite Congress's stricture, Washington's February 21, 1778 recruiting instructions stated that the officers were expressly forbid enlisting any boys, old men, or slaves, with no mention of barring free blacks. Eventually, individual states began allowing enslaved soldiers as well, and by 1778, they formed a sizable minority in Washington's army. And I have to emphasize that free blacks were never evicted from the army and continued to serve during the entire 8-month paper exercise of deciding if they should be soldiers or not. Several observers noted the fact of African Americans in the ranks, some unfavorably with the claim they were unsuited to be soldiers, but positive remarks were in the majority. In response to John Adams' October 1775 question about black soldiers in the Massachusetts regiments, Adams called them unsuitable for service. General John Thomas noted, "In the regiments at Roxbury, the privates are equal to any that I served with last war," and that would have been the French and Indian War. "Very few old men, and in the ranks very few boys. We have some Negroes, but I look on them in general equally serviceable with other men for fatigue and inaction. Many of them have proved themselves brave." Europeans were also complimentary. In December 1777, a German officer wrote of the American Revolutionary Forces, "The Negro can take the field in his master's place. Hence you never see a regiment in which there are not a lot of Negroes, and there are well-built, strong, husky fellows among them." And this statement refers to masters enlisting their enslaved men into military service in place of themselves. And Baron Ludwig von Closen, aide-de-camp to French General Rochambeau, wrote in July 1781, "I had a chance to see the American army man for man. It is really painful to see those brave men almost naked with only some trousers and little linen jackets, most of them without stockings, but, would you believe it, very cheerful and healthy in appearance. It is incredible that soldiers composed of men of every age, even children of 15, of whites and blacks, unpaid and rather poorly fed, can march so fast and withstand fire so steadfastly." As for numbers, Closen claimed, a quarter of Washington's army were Negroes, merry, confident, and sturdy. Regarding Closen's estimate of numbers, my research indicates that while the proportion of black Continentals likely increased in the later war years, in 1781 there were perhaps closer to 10 to 15% of the army. Okay, where was I? Now let us look a little bit more into numbers. In 1775, free blacks comprised less than 1% of the overall population, and slaves formed 18%, roughly 5,000 to 7,000 African-American soldiers and sailors, free and slave, served the revolutionary cause. In August 1778, a document entitled "A Return of Negroes in the Army" tallied the number of black men in 15 brigades of General George Washington's forces at White Plains, New York. Long thought to enumerate all the men of African descent in those brigades, we now know it reveals the numbers of enslaved soldiers in those forces. As an in-depth study by historian Matthew C. White has shown that in mid to late 18th century legal or official documents, and often in other contexts, the term Negro alluded to enslaved people. Thus, that roster shows there were 755 slave soldiers in Washington's army that month. In a force totaling almost 21,000 rank and file, corporals, music, and private soldiers, they comprised 3.6% of the whole. By themselves, enslaved soldiers could form two understrength regiments, each equal to or larger in size than most other serving Continental regiments. We have no idea how many free blacks were then serving, but if they were on a par with their enslaved comrades, 7.2% of the force in question were free and enslaved black men. And there are good reasons to suppose that free blacks in the Army were fewer than the enslaved soldiers. Excuse me. Let's see. Since we have no images, the six brigades that had the highest proportions of enslaved soldiers in the Army return were there were three New England brigades and three Southern brigades. So that just emphasizes the fact that there were a sizable number of black soldiers in the Southern units as well. As seen in our discussion of the 1778 Army return, the proportion of African American soldiers was relatively small. As I said, 3.6% of the whole. But that's not as important as their mere presence in mixed regiments. One reason is the equation of military service with citizenship, a concept that continued into at least the mid-19th century. More importantly, foreign observers and others likely considered African Americans serving alongside white soldiers as a radical revolutionary statement, almost on par with taking up arms against the King's Army and seeking independence for Britain. It may have been an unintentional and to some an unwelcome political statement, but it was just as powerful as the purposeful and pragmatic arming of blacks during the 1860s American Civil War. From numbers, let's turn to two individual soldier stories. These come from veterans' 19th century pension narratives, which historian John C. Dan called one of the largest oral history projects ever undertaken. Jacob Francis was born in New Jersey and eventually served in the Massachusetts Continental Regiment for 1 year and then in the New Jersey Militia from 1777 to the war's end. Francis was born in January 1754 and testified, when I was of age, I was bound as an indentured servant by my mother, a colored woman, to one Henry Rambell in Amwell, New Jersey. His indenture was sold to 3 other masters and eventually, at a little over 13 years of age, to Joseph Saxton, who took him from New York to an island in the Caribbean and then to Salem, Massachusetts, where his contract was sold one more time. In January 1775, his contract ended, having served his last master for, according to Francis, 6 years until I was 21 years of age. Still living in Salem, Jacob Francis enlisted in autumn 1775 for 1 year in Colonel Paul Sargent's 16th Continental Regiment belonging to Massachusetts. During that term, he served at the Boston Siege and witnessed the battles of Long Island and White Plains. A short time after the fall of Fort Lee, on the New Jersey side of the Hudson River, Francis and his comrades marched across New Jersey, crossed the river into Pennsylvania, and then marched down to a camp, in his words, off from the Delaware River, a few miles below Coriol's Ferry and above Howe's Ferry, where he lay a week or two. In his pension application, Jacob quite accurately described the December 26, 1776 attack on the Hessians at Trenton. He wrote, "We received orders to march, and Christmas night crossed at the Delaware River down to Trenton early in the morning. We entered the west end of the town, and General Washington came into the north end. We marched down the street from the river road into the town. General Washington was at the head of the street coming down towards us, and some of the Hessians were between us, and there we had the fight. After about half an hour, the firing ceased. General Lord Sterling, an American general, rode up to Colonel Sargent, and we followed him down through the town toward Assunpink Creek and crossed to the north side of it, where we were formed in line in view of the Hessians who were paraded on the south side. Being hemmed in, the Hessians surrendered, grounded their arms, and marched down to the old ferry below the Assunpink Creek, where they were ferried to the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware." Jacob Francis soon ended his Continental Army career, being discharged at Trenton and returning to Amwell soon after the battle. Of all the Black Virginia Continentals I found, Andrew Pebbles had perhaps the most varied career. In his pension testimony, Pebbles noted he didn't recall the year he enlisted, being a poor, unlearned mulatto. According to his military records, it was September 15, 1777. He testified that he joined the camp at Valley Forge and was placed under the command of Captain Lewis Booker, 11th Virginia Regiment, for 2 years. At Trenton, he served 1 year in the artillery under Captain William Miller, 1st Continental Artillery Regiment, who commanded the gun with 12 men to which he belonged. He served for 2 years under Captain Micah Rudolph of Maryland in the light infantry commanded by Colonel Harry Lee, who was the father of Robert E. Lee. Lee's command was composed of infantry and cavalry and called Lee's Legion. He was in 3 general actions at Monmouth, Guilford Courthouse, and Eutaw Springs. At Eutaw Springs, he received 3 wounds. He was wounded in the shoulder slightly, lost the thumb of the left hand, and was bayoneted in the belly. He was discharged on Combahee River honorably. The day before he was discharged, he was in a battle in which Colonel John Lawrence, who commanded in the absence of Colonel Lee, was killed. That was on August 27, 1782, on the Combahee River. Pebbles, though a free man, had to deal with the issue of slavery post-war. In his pension, he testified, "By occupation, I am a miller. From the infirmities of old age, increased by the wounds received in the Revolutionary War, I am not able to render much service to my employer. I am a free mulatto. My wife and child who live at the mill where I do are slaves. My wife's name is Rachel, aged between 50 and 60 years, and my child's name is Ursula, aged 11 years. I found 3 other Southern soldiers who actually had enslaved family members after the war, all of whom were unable to assist their husbands in what they needed to do. But augmenting those, in 1789, veteran Jacob Francis struck up another small blow for freedom. Former slave Phyllis Duncan testified she was present and saw Mary Francis married to Jacob Francis by Cato Finley. At the time of said marriage, Phyllis and Mary Francis and Cato Finley all lived with and were the slaves of Nathaniel Hunt, where the marriage took place. Jacob Francis immediately after his marriage bought Mary from her master, Nathaniel Hunt. Mary, in a few days, left the employ of Hunt and went with her husband, and since then lived together as man and wife up until the death of Jacob. They raised a family of children. I now want to speak of the African American women who, by their own free will or the will of others, served with the Army. To correct the popular idea of Army women, black and white, they were, by and large, respected and respectable. Any women who were not long tolerated. I discovered a number of black women with the Army, some of whom were servants. One of those women was Rachel, called Sarah by her enslaver, a woman who emancipated herself and her son. Another was enslaved cook Hannah Till, who with her husband Isaac served in General Washington's military household. Mrs. Till waited on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River on December 26, 1776, to feed her general on his return after the Trenton battle. Her husband Isaac, also enslaved and a cook to the general, actually fought in the battle. A year later, Hannah gave birth to a son at Valley Forge. Before the war's end, Hannah and Isaac purchased their own and their children's freedom. But I want to discuss one woman, Judith Lines, and read a portion of a letter written to her by her husband, published for the first time in my first book. To preface the Lines letter, John Lines enlisted in the 5th Connecticut Regiment in March 1781 for 3 years. Part of his time was spent at West Point and other Hudson Highland posts. By Judith Lines' own testimony, they married in July 1781. She recalled, "The next summer after I married, he sent for me to come to him. I think the place was called the Highlands. At that time, my husband was a waiter for Colonel Sherman, and while at the camp, I had the smallpox. I think I stayed about 3 or 4 months." Mrs. Lines noted in a pension application, "My husband used to write to me when he was in the Army, and I have one of his letters now, which I give to the magistrate, who takes this my deposition. It is dated November 11, 1781, and is in the handwriting of my husband." Now, the letter. John Lines wrote, "I take this opportunity to send you, my dear and loving wife, to let you know that I am well, and hoping these lines may find you and the children well. This is the 6th letter of mine, and I haven't received one. I belong to Colonel Isaac Sherman's regiment, Captain Bryce's company. We lay at Fishkill now. I should be very glad if you would send me a letter how you have lived this summer, and whether the house is done, and whether you killed that cow, or whether you have got another. I want to know all these things very much. I intend to come home this winter if I can, but I don't know if I can. If I could see you myself, then I could talk with you, my dear wife, as I like. I have seen hard times. I have lived 11 days with bread only. I remain your loving husband until death, John Lines." Mrs. Lines' letter not only tells of her own circumstance, Mr. Lines' letter not only tells his own circumstances, but Judith's too. On her own, she was raising 3 children, the youngest about 4 years old. Judith was also running a small landholding, possibly by herself or with the help of relatives or a hired hand. We also don't know if she took her children to camp in 1782 or left them behind, but by her own testimony, Judith had smallpox while with the army, a deadly and disfiguring disease that most soldiers had been inoculated against. Black men indeed proved good soldiers and citizens, even when faced with the growth of racism beginning at the end of the 18th century and accelerating in the 1800s. Racial animosity was reflected in the military, too. In the French and Indian and Revolutionary Wars, American forces were largely integrated and inclusive. The exclusion of black men from the American Army first took hold in the 1790s, though not by government mandate. By 1802, integration was back, with support or lack thereof already split between North and South. The ban on black soldiers in federal and state regiments is tied to the ascent of Southern commanders before, but especially after the War of 1812. Towards the end of that conflict, with James Monroe as Secretary of War and men such as South Carolinian George Izard in high command and Virginian Winfield Scott a rising star, there seems to have been a sub-rosa movement to cull men from the Army. Oddly enough, one piece of evidence was included in the 4th U.S. Infantry soldier Richard Boynton's enlistment record, where North Carolina Colonel Henry Atkinson noted, quote, "Discharged May 1, 1815, under an order from the War Department directing all soldiers of color should be discharged." That can be paired with Major General Izard's July 1814 letter to Secretary of War John Armstrong concerning newly arrived black recruits. Izard posed a quasi-question, noting that there was some years ago, and that was in the 1790s, a regulation of our service prohibiting the enlistment of Negroes and people of color. I've not heard of it being enforced. And of course, integration was brought back in the Army in 1802. In 1817, President Monroe appointed South Carolinian John C. Calhoun as Secretary of War, position he occupied until 1825. Calhoun had a profound impact on the United States Army, including a comprehensive reorganization and the creation of the West Point Military Academy. Concurrent with the Missouri Compromise, Calhoun implemented a ban on black soldiers, not via federal law, but in a mundane February 1820 Army order regarding recruiting. Issued by the Adjutant and Inspector General's office, it directed no Negro or mulatto will be received as a recruit of the Army. Following that, Winfield Scott's 1821 General Regulations for the Army restricted enlistment to all free white male persons. That explains why black men were barred from serving in federal regiments in the 1840s war with Mexico, and in part why segregated regiments became the norm from the American Civil War to the mid-20th century.
Hey, John, real
And
quick, I'm going to interrupt one more time. Would you just stop the screen share? Because it's still actually popping up with a little notice for us. So if you could just stop the
sure,
share. There we go. Perfect. Thank you.
okay, cool. I was in hopes it would pop in. Um, in closing, for many black veterans, service in the War of the Revolution was a mark of pride. The first Revolutionary War pension legislation was enacted in 1818. The ensuing acts required that veterans show they were in need in order to be awarded a pension. In July 1820, Artillo Freeman submitted a tally of his belongings. With no real estate or fixed income, Freeman noted, "He has no trade but picks oakum for a living when he is able to work." Mr. Freeman's possessions included bed and beddings, 4 chairs, crockery, pots, kettles, pans, 1 coat, 3 shirts, 1 chest and trunk, and his wife and child's clothes, a small quantity of personal apparel, and 1 pig, all worth $15.75. At the end of the list, he added one more item: Revolutionary War uniform, invaluable. And that's it. I thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Jordan. That was very, very informative. So we'll have some questions coming in here. I do have a couple to start with. So were there any differences in terms of the clothing or the equipment that was issued to the black troops within these regiments, or did they receive the same types of things?
They received the same type of whatever. Since regiments were integrated, they basically received the same as the white soldiers in their own regiments. And with the segregated Rhode Island Regiment, First Rhode Island Regiment, they received the same clothing as the Second Rhode Island Regiment, which was all white. Um, and even in pay, there was no difference in pay, unlike the American Civil War, where black soldiers, I think, were paid $10 as opposed to $13 for white soldiers. And the black soldiers also had, I think, $2 or $3 deducted for a clothing allowance. So the black soldiers during the Civil War made much less, and that wasn't made good until 1865, and then not even to all black soldiers.
Interesting. All right, we have another question about the free women of color or the women of color that were followers with the army. Were they eligible for any kind of pensions after the war?
The only way they would be eligible for a pension would be if their husband had served. The only woman that I'm aware of that received a pension is Margaret Corbin, who was wounded at the Battle of Fort Washington in November 1776. She basically manned an artillery piece, and she eventually joined the Invalid Regiment, and basically was part of the garrison at West Point after the war. So she's the only woman who received a pension on her own.
All right, so next question coming in. The British attempted to recruit enslaved individuals with the promise of freedom. Did those efforts ever manifest for the British?
They did to a certain extent. It resulted in one black regiment, and that was, of course, the Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. But that only lasted 1 year. It was decimated by smallpox. Um, British regiments really didn't use black soldiers under arms. And the commander in chief also of the British Army also barred blacks from serving under arms in loyalist regiments. But eventually, that went by the wayside, at least partially. By by 1782, you had a unit like the Black Dragoons, which was formed of freed slaves. It was a cavalry unit of about 50 or 60 men, commanded with black commanders also. And they fought well through 1782 in the South. And now those are loyalist units on the establishment, which means they were supplied by the crown. Loyalist militias or loyalist irregular units did have black men under arms in the ranks. And on the frontier, Butler's Rangers also had some black men serving under arms too. But by and large, they served in laboring capacities in the British Army and even in loyalist units.
So I have a follow-up question to that. In cases where free men of color that were serving in the Continental Army were taken prisoner by the British, given the fact they weren't being used as combatants. How were they treated differently than white prisoners, or were they also treated the same?
Well, in the Phillipsburg, the 1779 Phillipsburg Declaration, which Henry Clinton, who was then commander in chief of the British Army, he basically offered safety to all blacks all slaves belonging to rebels. So a lot of enslaved men, women, and children joined the British at that time, and of course they did join before that too. Uh, along with that declaration, he also threatened that any black men caught in arms serving the Continental Army or serving the cause for independence would be enslaved. Uh, I haven't seen that. I haven't seen anywhere that he followed through. I found one pension of a Rhode Island soldier who was enslaved after he was captured, eventually escaped. But I haven't seen any other instances where that was held to. Um, and he may have just meant that because I think he used the word Negro, so I think he might have just meant any enslaved men serving with the Continental Army or for the cause of independence. Um, if you were if you were caught at sea, though, all that you could either be taken as a sailor on board on one aboard one of the British ships, and it's possible you could have been enslaved too, because at sea, if blacks were taken, a lot of time, or there were times when they were actually enslaved, even if they had been free. So maritime service is an entirely different ballgame.
Hmm, interesting. Interesting. All right. Well, it looks like that's all that we have coming in for questions right now. So, John, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us tonight. Sorry for the technical issues,
Yeah.
um, but this has been really great. Um, Again, John's book, his most recent book, Don Troiani's Black Soldiers in America's Wars, 1754 to 1865, is available here in the O Service Village gift shop. So if you'd like a copy, I'd encourage you to grab it here at the museum. But again, thank you, John, so much, and everyone have a great night.
Thanks so much, Derek.
Take care.
Bye bye.